In this module, we're going to look at managing information. Now, we've already said that your information assets, both your personal information assets and the company's, are probably the most important thing that you're going to be dealing with in a IT security sense. So I'm going to cover in this module two elements. One is what the law says and the laws surrounding information management and IT. And the second is some best practice that you can start putting in place to make sure you're managing your information in the right way. As you're going through it, think, is the information that I'm dealing with, is it classified? How important is it to the company? How important is it to the individuals that that information covers? Because personally identifiable information is probably the key thing to think about in terms of its impact if it gets compromised or lost. So, let's just think about why things are compromised or lost. One of the challenges, if you keep records of many individuals, one of the challenges you've got of securing that information is making sure those individuals don't suffer identity theft. Put it in your own context. If someone got to know your bank details and set up another bank account in your name and use that for fraudulent transactions, you probably wouldn't like it. Well, imagine if the information assets your company holds are compromised and exactly that happens to them. So beware of those phishing attacks we've already looked at, and look out. If you're looking at your own bank account, for example, look out for unexplained behaviour. Look out for checks that just don't go uncleared, or transactions that you didn't know had gone through. So just back to be aware. So let's look at data loss. So where does data loss actually occur? Well, I've already talked about phishing attacks and compromising your login credentials using Wi-Fi attacks and all those things. But actually, when we look at the major data losses over the last 10 years, most of them have come from insider attacks. They've come from someone within your organization who's actually compromised the data. Now, it's not necessarily they've done it maliciously. They may have shared something with someone that has led to that data getting out. Right? We've seen this a number of times with files being put in places that they shouldn't be. Public cloud sharing platforms are a classic for this. The other one is if your data in your company gets deleted or corrupted and you don't have a good backup, then your business may go under because that information asset is vital, especially if you're running, say, an online business. Can you imagine if, I don't know, let's take someone like eBay. Let's say eBay went down for 5 days or a day. What do you think that would do to their business? Do you think they could survive? Think about that in the context of your own business. Okay, so where the costs come from if you lose data? Well, there's the cost of recreating the data. If it's stuff survey data, for example, you've got to go out and resurvey people. All right. There's the cost of continuing without the data. So in other words, can your business survive without the data that you've lost? Right. But one of the things you will have to do when personally identifiable information is lost is you'll have to inform others about the loss. So if you followed any of those case studies over the last few years from Sony or Target or TalkTalk in the UK, a major cost of dealing with that breach is informing each individual that their information has been compromised and then putting in place anti-fraud measures to make sure that that compromised information isn't used for stealing money from them. So just think about that as a particular cost. Now, so that's what can happen in the world of information loss. What laws, what regulation is in place to actually try and stop that happening or encourage your organisation to make sure it's less likely? Well, there are 4 main regulations we're going to go through in this module. There are many that apply, quite a lot of the criminal law applies as well, but we're just going to look at 4. We're going to look at data protection regulations, we're going to look at Computer Misuse Act, we're going to look at the regulation of investigatory powers, and we're going to look at fraud. I am actually, under that investigatory powers, I'm also going to look a little bit at what your company is allowed to do under its general business practices. So just think about those 4 things though, all right, as we go through. So the first, Computer Misuse Act. Right, let me talk about computer misuse. Now, there's an interesting background to this one. In 1988, Prince Philip's Prestel details, and I'm old enough to remember something called Prestel, but probably you won't. Prestel was a very simple online service in the days before the internet. Well, Prince Philip's Prestel details were compromised, and used to set up dummy accounts. There was a big court case over it, and it led to the Computer Misuse Act being introduced in 1990. Now, even though it was introduced in 1990, actually it was quite well worded, because it basically says if someone uses an account or any IT asset for unauthorized use, right, then you're in breach of the Act. So stealing someone's credentials and then logging on as them is unauthorized use. So that's covered under the Computer Misuse Act. And that's a criminal act, so you'll end up with a criminal record. Let's talk about data protection. The Data Protection Act introduced a concept of this Information Commissioner. So if you hear me talk about the ICO or the Information Commissioner's Office at any module, that was introduced during the Data Protection Act. Now, what the Data Protection Act focuses on is this personally identifiable information. In other words, if you can identify an individual and associate that information with that individual, right, that's PII, personally identifiable information, right? The Act itself established the concept of fines for breaches of information, right, and the requirement to notify the Information Commissioner when a breach occurs. Just talk very quickly about the Regulation of Investigatory Powers, or RIPA, as we called it. This is what allows the police, local authorities and others to put surveillance in place, CCTV all the way up to phone tapping. Right. Now, it's not really going to affect you directly in your business, but a subset of RIPA actually enables businesses to put surveillance in place for their employees. And we'll talk about that just in a little minute. So if you hear RIPA, that's basically the police and local authorities and other people. Right. Another big one, the Fraud Act. Now, the Fraud Act was introduced to replace an awful lot of legislation. And it has a particular section, Section 11, which covers electronic fraud. So if someone uses, abuses your credentials under the Computer Misuse Act, that itself is a criminal act. But the fraud that they undertake using those credentials is covered by the Fraud Act. All right. So the other thing I was just going to quickly talk about was the Lawful Business Practice Regulations, which is a bit of a mouthful. But do you remember I said under RIPA, which sets up surveillance? Well, Lawful Business Practice Regulations enable your company, your organisation, to do the same things, enables them to monitor employees. There's been a case recently about, in a European case, about an employee in Romania whose Yahoo Messenger account was monitored by his employer because he had breached the acceptable use policy. Remember acceptable use policy? He'd breached the acceptable use policy, and that therefore the employer was perfectly within their rights to monitor his Yahoo Messenger account because he was using it for business activities. So in other words, just be aware that your employer can monitor your use of IT assets. All right, just a couple of other things I want to talk about, and then we can get away from law because we're not lawyers. Because we're members of the European Economic Area, that means all European legislation also applies. And there'll be a major change in 2017 coming through with something called the General Data Protection Regulations. I wouldn't worry about it at the moment, but you may see lots of press articles about the massive ramp up in fines available to the Information Commissioner, going from £500,000 up to €100 million. Well, that's because of the introduction of the General Data Protection Regulations. They're saying, don't worry about it at the moment, but it will be coming in. Okay, let's move away from the law and let's talk about some practical things that you can do. Number one, would you know who to contact if you suspected a breach? Well, let me give you who it should be. If it's information assets associated with your business, then start off with your own IT security team or your own security team. It may be a general security team. If you don't know who that is, talk to your IT help desk or whoever provides IT support for you. If it happens to you personally, right, then your first port of call is actually the police, because these are criminal acts and therefore the police will get involved. Right. There's a link at the bottom of this module to the police documentation, which will help you actually find the right places to go and how to report things. But generally just think personal police, right, company, IT help desk. So let's say you've had a breach, something's happened, you've been compromised. How do you get working again? Well, we're going to give you a little bit of practical advice about what happens if you delete some files, if you've got complete loss, or if you've been infected with malware. All right. So firstly, malware. If you've had a virus, for example, and it's either wiped or compromised your machine, if you're using a PC, right, or a Mac, you have the opportunity to go back in time to what's called a restore point, or something called Time Machine on the Mac, to put a known good copy of your software back on that machine. Right? You may need to have someone help you do that. If it's in a corporate context, your IT help desk will basically just wipe your hard disk and put the standard IT implementation on your hard disk. If it's personal, you might need to take it back to the shop where you got it or call in an IT specialist. If you've deleted a file, then you've got two choices. If you're taking regular backups, and remember we talked about regular backups being useful, you might be able to recover that file from a backup. If you can't recover the file from a backup, a classic case is on a camera where the SD card gets compromised, it gets corrupted or whatever, then you can go and buy software which can actually recover files from media. Right? More advice in the links at the end. Right? And if you get total loss of the device itself, well, report it to the police, right? And then go and buy another one, if you can afford it, and recover from your backup. I'll say it again. You remember that you're taking a backup. Good. Okay, that's dealing with what happens when something goes wrong. Let's talk about how to make information less vulnerable. Right? There are some very simple things you can do. Number one, protect everything with a password. And make it a reasonably difficult password to guess. Next, on the devices that you're using, let's say it's a computer, use an account that has limited access to the computer. So for example, in the Windows world or in the Macs, you can have admin accounts and they can do anything. And you can have simple user accounts, which basically can only access their own information. There's no reason why you should use an admin account for your day-to-day use of a computer. And if you use a simple user account, then that malware or phishing attack or whatever is going to try and get at your machine has far fewer places to go. Next one is encrypt. So these devices, for example, are encrypted by default. Most phones now are, but computers you have to choose to encrypt. Again, there are options that are open to you as a user to encrypt the information on your hard disk. It means if the computer gets stolen, or when it gets lost or stolen, right, unless someone has the password, they will find it very, very difficult to get any information out of that device. Okay, and last, and I'm going to say it again, I'm sorry to keep going on about this, but backups. You've got many choices to make a backup, right? All the way from having a second hard disk, using CDs, DVDs, burning things, up to backing up to the cloud. All right? And a lot of people are now using cloud backup. But no matter which way you're backing up, one thing I'd ask you to think about. If you lost the computer with all the information on it, could someone get at the information? Well, not if you've got a good password on it and it's encrypted. But if you lost the backup with all the information on it, could someone get at that information? So look for backup media, right? And this applies to the cloud as much to hard disks. Look for backup media that you can encrypt that can only be accessed using a strong password, or even preferably using a PIN number sent to your mobile phone or something like that. So that's my last word on backups. You'll probably notice that we're talking about backups in just about every module. Very important. Okay, so that's the end of this module. That was a quick whiz through managing information, some of the law associated with that information, and then practical steps to take to make it less vulnerable. What I'd like you to do is answer the question underneath, and I'll see you at the next module.